Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery and it's nighttime, as you can tell, because it's rather dark. So I'll turn some lights on. But I wanted to just tend to this before the day is through because I've got everything that's all set to go. It's just a matter of doing it and it doesn't take long. So what I'm talking about here is getting my newest bin, which is right down there. The little white one with no label on it. That bin is freshly built, awaiting a new population. And the bin up here, the one in the middle on the top shelf, is the oldest of my bins, which I've been working to depopulate. And on a few occasions, I've already run a few worms out of that bin in order to launch off these newer bins. But this most recent attempt to round up worms has been running for 9 days now since I most recently reset the edge feeding zone. And I just wanted to see if I can maybe scoop some of them out of there and get that bin started. And at the same time, I think I'm going to refresh the feeding zone in this bin to try to rekindle the ongoing migration of the worms out of the compost. So that at some point soon, hopefully at some point soon, I can harvest the compost out of that bin. So let's go ahead and we're going to scoop a bunch of worms out of here and throw them in there and introduce them to their new home. Okay, so now this edge over here is where the feeding zone has been going on for quite a long time now. And on numerous occasions now, this bin has been the source of worm populations, batches of worms coming out of the feeding zone to launch off new bins. So this is just another round of pulling the worms out. So the worms have been going at this for the past 9 days. 9 days ago, when I last extracted worms from here, rather than actually reloading the food into the feeding zone, I actually just took all of the old existing food that was still in the bin and simply recycled it and used that instead of loading fresh food into here. So it's mainly because of the fact that I did not load fresh food last time that I'm assuming that fresh food probably will be needed this go around. So I got a feeling that what was in there is going to be pretty much gone for the most part, or at least very heavily depleted. All the added moisture that I've got nowadays with these plastic sheets covering the material, I almost have to change my process to make sure you're not inadvertently bringing any worms out of the bin into a dry space where they might be uncomfortable. Now the feeding zone was reinforced very slightly with a little bit of greens from the clippings of my seedlings. So I'm growing stuff indoors under a lamp, and I did a little trimming the other day so the worms were given that material that came off those trimmings, and that's for the most part still in here. Some other hunks of bedding that are still in here too. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to excavate some worms out of here. So let's just move things aside a little bit and bring over this little small bucket that I've got here. Not a very big one, but I'm only unloading worms from one bin right now. Last time I took volunteer worms out of multiple bins and I needed a much larger container than this, but I think we'll be fine with this. So I think the best bet is just to do a clean cut. Just reach in here and grab them. Together with the food that they're occupying, the bedding that they're occupying, all the castings that they've made. Just bringing the whole shebang over. So what we have here is mainly castings. I don't think that, other than worms and castings, I don't think there was a great deal of food remaining in there. So it might be a good idea to refresh this feeding zone with a little boost of fresh food. So I brought the food down from the freezer in anticipation of wanting to do that. I mean, last time I decided not to, and I simply took whatever remaining food there was over here and used that as the material to reload this feeding zone. But you know, as I start examining some of this over here, I definitely see lots of castings, but not a lot of stuff that looks like residual food bits. It's like a peach pit or something. So yeah, I think I'm going to just go ahead and reload this feeding zone really quick, but I'm not going to make it very deep. I think I'm just going to use all of this existing leafy stuff here as cover again after we drop in a little bit of fresh food. I wonder why they're not going for it. I would have thought that by now this stuff would have been eaten up, but there must be other things in this bin that they prefer over these cuttings. Although I would think that in time it would all go, but it's still sitting here after I don't know how many days. Yeah, the material right near the feeding zone is really nice, really beautiful stuff. I mean, it doesn't really appear to have any food scraps in it at all. It's just a whole bunch of worm castings. The only problem with it is that it's inundated with worms. Worms that I wish would move out so I can grab all of their old castings material and be done with this bin already. So I'm going to assume that us reloading this and giving them a fresh place to go will be successful if we try it. So why not? Let's give it a go. So I've got my box of leaves here, and I'm going to revive one of my old little tricks here, which is using a partition, a cardboard partition, between what I'm treating as finished compost and the section that I'm treating as the feeding zone. So I'm going to see how this goes. It's worked well for me in the past, so I'll lay in a little bit of leafy matter as the foundation for this feeding. Grab some stuff from the bottom of the bag, nice small particles, to make the feeding zone into a nice smorgasbord of different types of fruits and veggies for them. I'm also putting in some grit. And some coffee too. Okay, so like I said, I'm not going very deep with this. I'd prefer to keep it nice and shallow. And besides, we've still got a lot of this lingering, remaining leafy matter that we can put back in. Hopefully at some point soon they'll begin eating this too. This is a peach pit. We'll keep that here in the feeding zone as well. Experimental type items. And get the last of these few bits of leaf back over into the feeding zone. And some pieces of bedding, I think. No, this is probably a banana stem, yeah. With all those little fibrous strands. You can see little tiny worms inhabiting it, cruising around on the inside of it. Yeah. It's always interesting to see how different things look after the worms have had a chance to start working it down. Going to drop a little tiny bit more leafy matter right across the top, just to get it all covered up nicely. Now before we put the lid back on here, let's set these little guys aside briefly. I'd also like to just get a sense of how things are going in here. It was only a couple days ago that I checked in on this side to see how this material was progressing, and I kind of started up a little bit, agitated it in the hopes that maybe it would help it dry, create some little air cavities, little air pockets. So I figured let's do a little bit of that again here. In addition to trying to aerate it out and air it out, aerate it, air it out, so that it becomes a little bit more crumbly, a little less muddy, and ultimately a little less cozy for the worms to be in, because right now it is pretty damp, and that's probably got a lot to do with why the worms are digging it, why they're enjoying just staying in it. And how many of them there are. There are just so many of them in here. Wow. It's going to take a lot of, I think it's just going to take a lot of time for all these worms to eventually, come to the realization that the food supply within this tub of castings is pretty much depleted, and it's time to go looking for more. I mean, I'm sure that they're having no problem finding scraps and stuff like that, so I just hope it runs out soon so that they start making their way over into the feeding zone and abandon this material. So out here on the far edge, the furthest away from the feeding zone, it's a different story. There's definitely not as many worms populating this material over here. Let's go over here where I didn't really mess with it yet. If we pull a whole bunch of stuff right from the very bottom, there's definitely a couple worms in it, but not like we saw right over here on this side. So the material is a little drier too, so it is in time going to become a little bit more dry, a little bit more crumbly, and as a result of that, a little bit less comfortable for the worms to be in. So hopefully that'll start, triggering their movement over into the new feeding zone. The other tactic that's happening here is also the placement of the plastic right over the feeding zone area, so that the condensing moisture that occurs when the material in the bin tries to evaporate during the course of the day, it gets caught by that plastic cover and drips right down into here, whereas the material on this side is just left with just a single sheet of newspaper to allow it to air out. So any moisture trying to wick off of the top and evaporate into the air is allowed to do so without a problem. Just has to go through that piece of newspaper, which is no problem. So yeah, I think it's just gonna take time. So we've got ourselves a nice big batch of volunteers in the other little tub, ready to get moved into their new home. But this was also a little bit of a stall tactic, because another thing that I'd like to do before we close up shop on this bin and return it to the shelf so they could continue their work is once again bring this little container back into the picture. But now that all the worms have squirmed down into the material, I'm hoping that this might be an opportunity for me to just peel off some of the more or less finished castings from the top. So if you look at the material, it's got a worm or two in it, but most of them have just made their way down into the deeper portions of the tub. So I think by doing this, we can leave a lot of the casting material behind, sacrificing a few of the volunteers that we've already rounded up here, but it's going to be just a small, tiny number, really, compared to the number of worms that we've got in this tub. So we've got a whole bunch of volunteers ready to go. And I'm sure that if I left it again for a while under these bright lights, they would squirm down again and afford me another opportunity to maybe skim off a little bit more casting material and be left with worms only. Let's see if I even want to bother with that. It probably doesn't hurt to bring along a little bit of the material that they're already occupying, just to keep them kind of safe and cozy until it's time to make their way out into the material of their new home. So let's get things in this bin here covered up again, and the bin back up on the shelf, so we've got a little bit of room here. And into their new home. I've opted to continue all of my new bin starts using the shallow bins. So it'll just be the way I do it for the beginning. Eventually I think I'll just run out of room in these shallow bins and I'll probably move into the deeper bins. But I figured I would use these shallow bins to start my new populations off. So enough talk, let's get these guys launched. Here we go. Nothing much to it other than just dumping them out. It's always kind of nice when you don't see any worms stuck in the container that they were transported in. So I'll do what I usually do, is just try to spread them out a little bit to see if I can get a sort of a visual sense of how many worms I ended up with here. Large chunks of castings that they're occupying. So let's give these little guys a couple minutes to squirm their way down into the material and make themselves at home. Alright, I think we got ourselves a new worm bin. Looking pretty good. I think for the most part they've all squirmed out of view. You can see a couple here and there already, but that's not for long. They're going to dive down into those nice leaves and food and bedding and everything that they're going to find underneath there, and hopefully find it very cozy and comfortable. So all I've got is a little bit of wrap up here. Just got to cover some things up and put things away. But that's all boring. I won't keep you around for that. I'll just take this as a chance to say thank you. Thank you for watching, and hopefully you enjoyed the video. Stick around with me for one more minute while we christen this bin with today's date and an official sticker just to make it real. Alright everyone, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to give me a thumbs up. It's always really appreciated, and also consider becoming a subscriber to the channel as well. That's always really appreciated too. Thanks for watching. Bye now.